Hello and welcome to Mountain Mama, a family lifestyle channel. My name is Mary Silverberg and I am the mother of 6 grown children. I have 3 fabulous young ladies and 3 fabulous young men. 2 of them are married to wonderful spouses and I have 3 beautiful grandchildren. And this episode is all about how I helped 2 of my young children to eat healthier and to lose weight. So one was a little girl. She was a toddler, about 2 years old. The other was a young man, a teenager, about 14 years old. And I'm going to break this episode into 2 parts. One is going to be what I actually did, and the other part is going to be why I think it worked. And then I'm going to have another section of extra thoughts because I wasn't exactly sure in which section to put those thoughts. But first, I need to say that I am not a medical professional and I am not sharing medical advice. This is simply my experience, what we did in our family and what worked for us, and hopefully you all will be able to glean some benefit from that. Okay, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is why I think this worked for us. Why I think we were successful in getting our children to achieve a healthy weight. And I don't think this will work for everyone. So that's why I think this is very important to share this with you. There's 3 parts to this. The first is being that my husband and I were the established authority in our home. Our children were not perfect. They were not angels. They were very active, full of energy, sticky, messy, loving, full of hugs and kisses, and they were in submission to us. And this is due mostly to the credit of my husband. I struggled with this. It was difficult for me to be consistent in disciplining them. As a stay-at-home mom, I was very busy. 6 children. You got a lot going on. It's very difficult to stop in the middle of something, address bad behavior, take the time to explain to the child what they did wrong, what the discipline's going to be, and then follow through and do it on the first time. You can't say if you do this one more time. So establishing parental authority, especially my authority, because my husband worked a lot of the time. Even when he was in town, he was working long hours. So it was up to me. And he didn't let me get away with it. He held me accountable for holding the children accountable to me. And actually, it may seem like it was hard. It may seem like it took a lot of time, but it would have been a lot harder and it would have taken a lot more time and we would have had less freedom if I had not followed through and done it. And that section alone could be a whole episode on its own, but for the sake of keeping to the topic of how I help my children to lose weight, I just want to say that we were the established authority in our home and that I was established as an authority figure, and my children, while they weren't perfect, they were in submission to me. The next thing is we were both on board with addressing the problem or addressing the issue. My husband and I both agreed, we were both on the same page that it needed to be dealt with. And again, I need to give my husband the credit because he was the first one to notice it in both cases, in the case of my toddler and in the case of my teenager, that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. And maybe I was in denial about it. Maybe I was just wanting to give it a little more time to see if it corrected itself on its own, because sometimes that will happen. But my husband was very kind in this. He didn't nag me about it. Maybe once every other week or maybe once a month, he would bring it up and he would say, I think we have a problem here. I think they're gaining too much weight. I think they're a little bit too heavy. And it took me probably a couple months to acknowledge it and to realize, okay, this problem is not correcting itself on its own. So maybe it was even several months because I remember it being a while before we did anything about it. And because I didn't want to overreact either. But anyway, we both got to where we acknowledged the problem. We are both on board. We are committed to doing something to fix the problem. And when I say we, that means me, because I was the main caregiver. I was the one who was home with them most of the time. My husband worked long hours. He worked Saturdays. He had off Sundays, but in between church services, he would sleep most of the time because he was exhausted. So when I say we were on board, it was very important for me to be on board, fully committed to addressing this issue, even if it was a minor issue, because that's the only way it was going to get addressed. Now, if you are the main caregiver and your spouse is not on board with you, I think this will still work. It would just be more difficult. But I knew that I am in control of the food supply in our home. I am the one who served 3 meals a day. And for the most part, we did sit down and have 3 family meals together. And even when the children were going to school, which we did for several years, I think it was 4 years before we homeschool, I still packed their lunch. I still allowed them to get cafeteria lunches a few days of the week, but I was still in control of that. And because they were in obedience to me, they might try and get away with something here and there. For the most part, they were going to listen to me. So I would just like to encourage you that if your spouse, if your husband or your wife is not on board, but you are the main caregiver, then you can still do this. You can do this. As the main caregiver, I realized that it's my responsibility to make sure my children were eating healthy and that they were being active. So I am at the top of the food chain. I am the lioness of the family. I'm the mama bear. I'm the mountain mama bear. I control the food supply in my home. So I knew that this was on me. This was my responsibility. It was my responsibility to keep my children from harming themselves by allowing them to eat too much or to not live an active, healthy lifestyle. I had to admit that if my children were overweight, it wasn't the children's fault. They're children. Who's the adult? Me. I'm the grown up. I'm the one responsible. I'm the one in charge. So I acknowledged there was a problem, thankfully, because my husband helped me with that. And I was committed to doing something about it. I was committed to correcting the problem, and thankfully we corrected it at an early stage. I like to think of it as, a big ship. We had gotten off course a little bit, and it's a lot easier to correct a little deviation than to make a 180 turn. So I realized there was a problem. I committed to doing something about it. And I committed to addressing the issue in a respectful way, in a respectful, kind, loving, and reasonable way. I expect my children to respect me, and I treated them respectfully also. Even as children, even as I'm the adult, I'm the one in authority, they still deserve respect from me. And that's what I did. These are the reasons that I believe we were successful in helping our children to be more healthy. We had established our parental authority in the home. We were both on board with addressing and correcting the issue, and even more importantly than both being on board, myself as the main caregiver was on board and committed to helping them be more healthy. And I really think that's why it worked. This brings me to the episode of what we actually did to help the children. And it was 2 very different scenarios because there was a little girl who was a toddler, and then there was a young man who was a teenager. So I'm going to start with my daughter first. And by the way, I forgot to mention that I did get permission from each of those children who are adults now to share this story because, like I said, I did want to be respectful to them, and they both agreed to let me share this. So my daughter was a toddler. She was about 2 years old, 1.5, 2.5. And once my husband convinced me that it was a problem, and I came to understand, okay, this is not just baby fat and it's not going away, we talked about it, and we decided The problem was she was eating seconds of dessert. Now, I have a real sweet tooth. I'm a homemaker. I like to bake. I like to cook. We had a lot of homemade desserts in our family. We didn't have it with every dinner, but we often had dessert with dinner. And I realized that she was getting a second helping of dessert, and that had to go. So the main thing we did was no seconds of dessert. She still got a portion of dessert, which was very reasonable for, her age, for her size, but she just didn't get a second. And with snacks, she could have a snack if we were having a snack, but she didn't get a second helping of a snack. And sometimes a snack might be a cookie, which was fine for a toddler. She was very active, but she didn't get a second cookie. And when we had meals, there were times when I would allow her to have seconds, but I was very particular about making sure that if she asked for seconds, it was a very small, tiny portion. And sometimes I would let her have a second helping, sometimes I wouldn't. A lot of times I wouldn't let her have a second helping. So I made sure she was getting, enough food. She wasn't deprived. She was still eating all the same foods that she ate before. The only difference was that she wasn't getting a second helping of dessert. And we didn't notice anything for a long time. I mean, it was months and months. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, wow, she really slimmed down. She never knew we were doing anything differently. I never talked to her. And you'd think you wouldn't talk to a 2-year-old. I talk to my 2-year-old. I explain things to them. I have conversations with them. I really tried to teach them about everything I was doing and explain why I was doing it. But I never told her she needed to lose weight. No. I never told her there was a problem. It was simply, and it really was simple, withholding a second helping of dessert. Children will test you. They will test their boundaries, which is natural. And I want to share something that happened early on where that daughter tested us as her parents. And it was early on in this journey. We were not giving her seconds of dessert, and we were heading to a family gathering at Grandma and Grandpa's in Missouri, and there was going to be a lot of food. And before we left, I said to my husband, I'm going to be in charge of getting her food. Please do not get her any food. Let me get her food for her. And it was a family gathering. I was going to let her have a little extra. It wasn't going to be this crazy, rigid thing that we had her on. This was a party. It was a holiday. She was going to have a little extra than normal, but I was still going to be the mama bear. I was the lioness. I was going to control what she had to eat, and I was going to make sure she didn't overeat. So we got there. We're having a good time. I got her a whole plate of food that was plenty for her, plus a little extra because I said it was a celebration. And she finished that, and you know what? She asked me for seconds, and I said, no, you can't have any now. Later on, you'll be able to have something, but you can't have anything right now. So, she said, okay, and she went on her happy way. Well, a little bit later, I noticed she had another entire plate of food that she was eating. And I was so shocked because I knew my husband wouldn't have given it to her because, we had agreed to this ahead of time that I was going to be the one to get her food for her. And I said, daughter, I don't want to say her name. I called her by her name, but I'm trying to keep this confidential. And I could do that because I have 6 kids, 3 boys and 3 girls. So I said, daughter, where did you get that food from? Because I was so surprised. And she said, Uncle Mike got it for me. And I was like, Uncle Mike, did you get this whole plate of food for her? And he said, well, yeah. She came up to me and she said, I'm hungry. And I said, well, do you want me to get you some food? And she said, yes, please. So I got her a plate of food. Well, of course, Uncle Mike wasn't in on this. He didn't know that my husband and I were trying to limit her food intake. And of course, she came natural to children, especially little girls, Well, mom's not going to get it for me. And if mom said no, she knew better than to ask dad. So, she was a pretty little girl and she batted her eyelashes and she went up to her Uncle Mike. She didn't go up to one of her aunts. She went up to her Uncle Mike and said, I'm hungry. And of course, he took care of his little niece. So I had this thought. My first thought was, I can't let her have it. I have to stick to my guns. I've established this routine. I have to do this. I have to be consistent. Thankfully, I checked that. And I thought, no, if I take this away from her, it's going to be devastating. It's going to hurt her feelings. It's going to humiliate her. She's going to burst out crying. She's not going to understand. So I decided, it's okay. Let her have it. Next time we go to a party, I will address her ahead of time. I will tell her, daughter, you may only get food from your mother. You may not ask your aunts. You may not ask your uncles. You may not ask grandma or grandpa for food. If you want food, mommy has to be the one to help you. And that's what we did. And I'm really thankful that I checked myself, that I didn't make a big deal out of it, that I let her have the food, but next time I knew what to do. So just be prepared for the test that's coming. Children will test you. That's normal. Try to remain calm. Try not to overact, and yet still be committed to, what should we call it? The mission? Yeah, the mission. I like that. That is what worked for my daughter, who was a toddler at the time, simply cutting back on dessert for her, which she still had dessert. It was just cutting back on seconds for her. And it happened so gradually, we hardly even noticed it until all at once we realized months later that it was working and it wasn't an issue anymore. Now for my son, it was a different story. He was a young man. He was a teenager, about 14 years old. I don't think the issue with him was so much what he was eating, although I do think that contributed to it. I think it was more he was at a stage where he wasn't as active as he normally was. And we were living out in the country at the time, and my husband's work had really slowed down. So the son was not as active going to work with his dad. And since we had less income, we had stopped taking karate lessons. Now, karate was a big part of our life. Sometimes we only went twice a week, but oftentimes we took class 5 times a week, and it was a great activity for the kids. But because we didn't have the income, we had stopped karate, so he had stopped going to work with his dad. And we were living out in the country. There was lots to do out in the country, but I think we must have kind of been at a lull at this time. So let's see, my husband again brought to my attention that there was an issue, there was a problem. He was getting a little overweight, and we needed to do something about it, and that meant me. So I decided that I was going to do something with him because I wanted to lose weight too. And I knew the best thing for him would be to have someone do it with him and have an example of doing it. So I never told him, I never said you needed to lose weight. I never said anything derogatory. I went up to him privately. We had a conversation, and I said, we're going to make a few changes. You haven't been exercising. You haven't been as active. It's going to be required that you exercise. Now, if you go to work with dad, that counts as exercise. If you're out chopping wood, that counts as exercise. If you cut the grass, that counts as exercise. Any of those things, you don't have to exercise that day. If it's a Sunday, that's a day of rest. You don't have to exercise on Sunday. But if a day comes along and you're not working with your dad, you're not doing some kind of active chore around the property, you have to exercise. And I told him, you can pick your exercise, but if you don't pick something, you're going to walk with me because I'm going to walk. That's going to be my exercise. I'm going to be doing this too, what I'm requiring of you. And I'm going to be walking. So if you don't have something that you can pick to do, then you're walking with me. And he said, okay. He didn't have any issue with it. And I think he realized there was an issue. Maybe he was even happy that I addressed it. I don't know. I know when I was a young adult and I gained weight, I didn't need anyone to tell me that I was overweight. I was painfully aware of it. So when I said we were going to make some changes, I tried to do it in a respectful, loving, not hurtful way. And I think he realized what I was talking about. Hopefully I did it well. So we established that. I also established that the same thing, seconds on desserts. He was still going to be able to have a reasonable portion of dessert. And I have to talk here about a man-sized portion. Women tend to cut portions women's size. And I learned early on that if my husband said he wanted a small piece of pie, that was different than what I considered a small piece of pie. His small piece of pie might be a big slice, what I considered a big slice of pie, or a medium slice of pie. So when I was going to give him a portion of dessert, it was going to be a man's size portion of dessert. He was a man. He was already adult size. So I want to stress here that I wasn't depriving him of anything. It was just portion control, even though he was still getting manly portions. So he was going to get dessert still. And then if he wanted seconds on dessert, or if he wanted seconds on anything in the main portion of his meal, it had to be the meat or fresh fruit or vegetables. He wasn't going to have seconds on things like bread or pasta. And I was going to do the same. I was going to hold myself accountable to the same standard. So that's what we did, the exercise and the food. And the food portion of it wasn't an issue. Actually, it was an issue, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. That test that came with my daughter came in a really different form with my son, but I will get to that. So we cut back ever so slightly on his food, but more importantly, he was active. And I thought it was very funny because he walked with me maybe once. I know he definitely walked with me once, maybe twice, and then he couldn't take it anymore. It was just too lame. It was not effective for him. He was a young man. He was strong. He was active. He needed something else to do, something manly and something that was challenging for him. So there was a bike on the property, and we lived out in the country, hilly roads. And he said, "Mom, I don't want to walk with you today. I'm going to go for a bike ride." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." So he took up bike riding, and man, did he bike ride. He would be gone for an hour or two, and he would come back soaked in sweat. But he loved it. He talked about being outdoors in the hills, the Missouri countryside, how beautiful it was, and he just loved it. And little by little, without hardly noticing it, after several months, he slimmed down. The test. Oh yes, the test came in a different form with my son. Did I mention that my 3 sons have type 1 or childhood diabetes or juvenile diabetes, which means they were all 3 insulin dependent? Well, it's very rare to have 2 in one family, but somehow I managed to have 3 children with diabetes. So at the time that child was a teenager, he was on an insulin pump, and I began to notice that his blood sugar was dropping more often than it used to. And when your blood sugar drops, you have to have a snack, you have to have carbohydrates to bring it back up. It can be a very dangerous situation. And it occurred to me that he was giving extra insulin through his pump so that his blood sugar would drop, so that he would have to have a snack. Now, I actually give him credit for this because, if you're going to have diabetes, why not take advantage of it? And this is what children do. They test their boundaries. So it was pretty, wise, pretty ingenious of him to do this. So it was pretty, wise, pretty ingenious of him to do this. So I really didn't hold it against him, but I'm the parent. I'm the authority. I have to make sure that he's doing what he's supposed to do. So I needed to address this, and I wanted to do it in a respectful way. So I said, "Son," well, I didn't say son, I used his name, but I said, "Son, I want to look at your insulin pump." And these things are little computers. You can tell how much insulin they've gotten at what time of day. There's basal rates. There's all different functions of it. So he looked quite guilty, and he handed me his pump. It's attached to him with a cord. So I'm standing right next to him. I'm looking at it, and I'm seeing that he's been bolusing. He's been giving extra insulin so that his blood sugar would drop so that he could eat more. And I gave it back to him and I just said, son, I know what you're doing and it's got to stop. I don't want you to think that you have to be hungry. If you're hungry, you can have a snack, but it's got to be a healthy snack. It can be fresh fruit. Um, it can be a piece of whole wheat toast with peanut butter. It can be a glass of milk. It can even be a glass of chocolate milk. If you're hungry, you don't have to be hungry. You can have a snack. It's got to be a healthy snack and it's got to be a normal size portion. And I also told him that I was going to be periodically looking at his insulin pump, and that was going to, I didn't say this, but I said that was going to keep him accountable. So he acknowledged this, and after that, it wasn't an issue again. The blood sugar was not dropping all the time like it had been. It would occasionally, because that's normal for someone with type 2 diabetes. But anyway, that was the test. That was how I addressed it. I treated him respectfully, and he respected me as well. Just to recap, with my teenage son, we did cut back a little bit on the food, but it was more of an issue with not enough exercise for him. So we established an exercise routine where he was exercising every day, even if it was working, like cutting the grass. But if he wasn't doing any chores like that, he would bike ride, which he really enjoyed. I think that was very helpful for him to find an activity that he enjoyed doing. And the issue took care of itself slowly over several months. It was the same as with my daughter. We really didn't notice anything because it happened so slowly. And I think that's the key. Small changes, small good changes over time took care of the problem. The other thought I want to share is about regret. I don't regret making my children eat healthy and live an active lifestyle. And I'm thankful that I don't have that regret. Had I not done it, I'm sure I would have regretted it. And was it easy? It wasn't really difficult, but it wasn't always easy. It's hard saying no sometimes, especially when your kid wants a second piece of cake or a second scoop of ice cream. That can be hard. But I'll tell you what, if those children had grown up being overweight as children and then overweight as adults, I imagine they would have regrets that I, as their mother, did not do my job and keep them healthy, at least as children. So I would encourage you to think about that. If you're struggling with saying no to your children, to that second piece of dessert, think about it. Are they going to have regrets as adults that, maybe I didn't do what I should have? I wasn't the mother I should have been as when they were young. And I think about my parenting now, and yeah, there were things that I did wrong, and I regret that. I'm thankful that my children love me and respect me, and they can forgive me for those things. Another thing I wanted to talk about is there is an hereditary factor to this, because I have six children all living in the same home. They have access to the same meals, the same activities, and yet two of them struggled a little bit. They had a little bump in the road with weight, and the other four didn't. It's never been a struggle with them. So I think there is something hereditary. But that doesn't mean that you can't take steps to overcome that. And they don't have to be drastic steps. They can just be small baby steps that you consistently take over time, so that you can incline yourself in the right direction. And I find it very interesting that these two children who struggled with this when one was a toddler and one was a teenager, when they became young adults, they each had a little bump in the road where they started to gain a little bit more weight and a little bit more weight. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, I wonder if they're going to have this struggle, as an adult, I never said anything to them because I said earlier, when I was an adult and I was overweight, I was painfully aware that I was overweight and I didn't need anyone to tell me. And actually, my father did say a couple things to me, and I don't hold it against him. He didn't know. He was trying to be loving. He was trying to help me, but it didn't help. It only made it worse. It made me eat more, if that makes any sense. I had to come to it on my own. I had to get the motivation to do it. But anyway, those two children, they each hit a bump in the road as adults. They were able to work at it and overcome it. And they're both healthy, active young adults now. In conclusion, this is what has worked for us. I believe this is why it worked for us. It's been our experience. I hope sharing this experience will encourage you. I hope it'll help you. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.